morning,
Mr. Kernaghan.
For the record, just before we commence, if I could formally seek leave to appear on behalf of Mr. Lloyd Owen. An application was made on Friday last, but I understand it's still going through the processes of the Commission. So I'll seek that leave if it's convenient to the Commission.
Nothing to say in response to that application,
No,
Mr. Wyatt. That application's granted, Mr. Kernaghan. Leave's granted.
Your Honour, the first witness is Mr. Owen. I call Dr. Lloyd Owen. While Mr. Owen is coming to the stand, might I tender a supplementary general tender bundle that includes a number of documents, including one related to the triad therapy called a problem list, and also the report of the expert Alan Borowski.
So the supplementary tender bundle will be 30.29 and the report of Dr. Borowski will be 30.30.
It's contained within the supplementary bundle, Your Honour.
Right.
Thank you.
So both will be marked 30.29. Thank you.
Your Honour.
Now, Mr. Owen, do you wish to take, Dr. Owen, do you wish to take the oath or the affirmation?
I'll take the affirmation.
The affirmation, thank you. So could you repeat after me, please? I do solemnly, sincerely and truly, declare and affirm that the evidence I shall give in this Royal Commission shall be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. Thank you, Dr. Owen. If you take a seat right where you are, please.
Sir, would you tell the Royal Commission your full name, please?
Yes, Lloyd Stanley Owen.
You've provided a statement which is dated the 24th of August 2015 that relates to your time as a superintendent in Winlaton and your employment generally by the department.
That's correct.
Is the evidence in that statement true and correct to the best of your knowledge?
Yes.
Your Honour, I tender that statement.
30.30.
Mr. Owen, Dr. Owen, you provided your curriculum vitae for the Royal Commission, and can I note some of your experience before we start discussing Winlaton? Prior to Winlaton, you spent 10 years in insurance as a claims investigator in middle management. Is that right?
Correct.
Sorry, you'll need to speak into the microphone, sir.
Yes, that's correct.
You first worked with young people in 1968? Or was it prior to that time?
Well, I had a long involvement, voluntary involvement with young people doing youth work. My wife and I were foster parents to two adolescent wards of state prior to that time, and I guess my whole life has had some aspects to do with young people, but this is perhaps the first employed.
In 1968 through to 1971, you worked at the Turana Youth Training Centre in administration and youth welfare. What was it that you did for Turana?
In the administration, I was doing clerical work in both the office and the store, but that was associated with the fact that I'd obtained a public service free place to study social work, and so for 3 of that 4 years, mostly it was away doing full-time study except for vacation periods, and then at the end of that time I was assigned as an assistant superintendent, so some of my duties then involved assistant superintendent work at Turana.
Prior to taking on the role of the assistant superintendent at Turana, were you actually a case officer or youth worker with any of the children?
No, not at Turana, no.
Was the assistant superintendent position in part a training position for the role of deputy or superintendent?
Yes, that would be so.
During your time at Turana, did you come to know a child by the name of Robert Cummings?
I can't say that I did, no.
At any stage while you were in Turana, did you become aware of the psychiatric unit which was over the road, Parkville?
No.
At any stage while you were at Turana, did you become aware of a child who was subject to aversion therapy?
No.
Otherwise known, or I would draw that, did you become aware of any child who was being subject to some form of electric shock therapy?
No, not at all.
So you studied your Diploma of Social Studies while you were working at Turana and you completed that degree, is that right?
Yes.
In 1972, you became Assistant Superintendent at the Langi Kalkal Youth Training Centre. Where was that located?
No, 1972 I was at Malmesbury Youth Training Centre, which is in Malmesbury.
And how long did you stay at that centre?
For that year. Initially I was working across Turana and Winlaton and then went to Malmesbury, so I was at Malmesbury for the balance of 1972.
What training centre was that? Was that for girls, boys, both?
No, it was with Langi Kalkal, Malmesbury. They were both adult youth training centres,
right,
catering for 17 to 21-year-old convicted young offenders.
And you were an assistant superintendent at that training facility?
At Malmesbury I was still an assistant superintendent. At Langi Kalkal I was appointed as deputy.
And how long did you remain at Langi Kalkal?
There for the whole of 1973. Until I was asked to transfer to Winlaton as a matter of urgency.
Who asked you to transfer to Winlaton as a matter of urgency?
It was the Director of Youth Welfare at the time, Mr Ken Williams.
And why was it that it was a matter of urgency that you transfer?
There had been some difficulties occurring at Winlaton and the person who was then acting as superintendent was reluctant to stay.
What were the difficulties?
I think, I don't know specifically what was happening at the time, but there was, obviously the sort of unrest that we did experience from time to time in those centres.
So in 1974 you commenced as superintendent at Winlaton?
Yes.
Can you tell the Commission how old you were at that stage?
34. Well, I would have turned 34 in that year.
And it was your first role as a superintendent?
Yes.
You worked at Winlaton until 1978, is that right?
Yes, I was substantively in the position of superintendent until I became the superintendent of Allambie in 1980. So I was substantively in that position until 1980, but effectively I was assigned to other duties from about mid-1978 onwards, I think.
And it was Dr Eileen Slack who took over from you as superintendent?
Yes, at that time she was the deputy there. Yep.
She had been deputy from
the time she arrived.
Yes, I see. So you had a period of overlap when she arrived in 1976?
Yes.
And then she took over from you around 78?
Around 78, yep.
I'll come back to your work with Dr Slack. At the time you took over from the superintendent, as superintendent, you'd had about 6 years' experience within these youth training centres, some with children, some with young adults. You were 34 years old when you took up the position of Winlaton. What did you find in terms of Winlaton? What was happening when you arrived?
I guess it was an institution. It was a complex place. It had 5 main units. It was busy. It was dealing with the young women in the state of Victoria who were there in virtually a last resort situation.
You were here yesterday for the evidence of Miss Marilyn Minister, is that right?
I did not hear any of the evidence from Miss Marilyn.
Didn't hear.
Minister.
You would recall Miss Minister during her time at Winlaton?
Yes, I recruited Miss Minister as an assistant superintendent there.
And she was there for the entire 4 years or so that you were there?
I can't recall exactly when she started, but when I started, she was not there. The deputy superintendent who was there at that time was a person named Althea Dean Johns, later became Althea Howard, and she remained there as deputy for some time until she took up a post at Windsor Youth Welfare Service.
Ms Minister describes Winlaton as pretty wild and woolly when she arrived. She says there was an authoritarian approach from some of the staff towards the children, that she was concerned with the quality of some of the staff, and she went on to agree that some of the staff were verbally abusive towards the children. Do you relate at all to any of that evidence?
Yeah, I think that that could be said. There would be degrees, I guess, in reflecting on what those words mean. I would think authoritarian would be the approach that would describe the actions of some of the staff, and that could be construed as verbally abusive when they are issuing commands. I can't say that I'm conscious of staff making derogatory or demeaning comments to the girls in the main, but sometimes people would get angry, and certainly there was an authoritarian element that was present.
She became aware of a lot of aggression amongst the residents, both towards each other and towards staff. Was that something that you were aware of in 1974 when you attended?
Yeah, there was some aggression. There were some incidents, but I wouldn't describe it as being totally out of control, and it didn't seem to me to be excessively different from what I'd been experiencing in the other 3 centres that I'd worked in until that.
In terms of what you experienced at Winlaton in 1974 with the aggression between residents and from residents to staff, did that change over the 4 years that you were there?
I think it may have changed. Yes, there would be times when there were more incidents than other times, but usually one could attribute that to the presence of particular young people who had come in with particular problems. Sometimes it was related to matters that would be going on with staff, but I wouldn't have described it as so extreme that it was very alarming, but any incident, of course, is alarming if there's the potential for violence or injury to any other person.
So at no stage during your period of 4 years were you particularly concerned by the level of, for example, bullying or physical violence between the residents?
Not excessively. I think there would have been some, and in some places, and at some times it might have been worse than others. But I think that between us, and there were some very, very good staff working at Winlaton, those matters were usually addressed and brought under control.
You said that you thought there was some change over the 4 years. Was there any reduction in tension or aggression during that 4 years?
I think so. I think that that we made quite a lot of an advance in the programming at Winlaton over that time. We had a lot of emphasis on improving our assessment capacities. We had a lot of emphasis on improving opportunities for kids in education and in employment preparation. We had some therapeutic efforts, including Dr. Slack's triad therapy approach, which would have had some sort of impact. I think our recruitment efforts over time would have brought people who were a bit more able to be attuned to the young people.
So was there any change in the authoritarian approach over the 4 years?
I think that diminished quite substantially over the 4 years, yeah.
Did it diminish as a result of any efforts made by you to do anything?
I think it diminished as staff turnover occurred, as people moved into other positions, as the climate in the institution improved in terms of communication and some of the organisational structures.
Do you remember a particular staff member called Florence Baxter?
Yes, I do.
Was she an example of what you would call the old school authoritarian approach?
I think you could say that. I wouldn't want to do her an injustice, but she was firm. She saw discipline as being important. I have heard it described as somebody who had a gruff exterior but a heart of gold. And I did see her do some very, very positive things with some of the young people.
So during your time there, you would have thought that Florence Baxter would have been someone who, although she might have been gruff towards the kids, would have protected them if she was aware that they were in danger?
I think she would have, yes.
And you would have thought that she would be a staff member who, if somebody reported some form of sexual abuse to her, she would have taken that seriously?
I think she would have, yes.
And that's because you yourself as an adult never experienced any form of aggression from her, did you?
Not directed towards me, no.
And you had faith in your staff at the time as being primarily concerned with the welfare of the children, is that right?
Yes, I did.
Okay, I'll come back to that. When you commenced your role at Winlaton, there was no particular position description that you became aware of, is that right?
Well, at the time I was making my statement, which was done in quite a hurry at the end of last week, I couldn't recall having a position, a duty statement. I've subsequently seen one and recalled it. I was probably led astray by the fact that when I was in a more senior position, we actually had a major campaign to create position descriptions for all positions in the department, and I thought that the duty statements may have been part of that, but there was a duty statement, yes.
In any event, regardless of the formal duty statement, it's the case, isn't it, that the superintendent could define their own role in a particular way, stamp their personality on the role?
I think that's true.
At the time that you commenced at Winlaton, was there any policy or procedure manual that dictated how to deal with any serious incidents?
There were certainly instructions, but my recollection over that 40 years is that we were always either developing or revising what was called a manual of instructions. Characteristically a duty of one of the assistant superintendents often, but it was something that was an ongoing task.
At the time, we have access to a manual from Winlaton from 1974
yes.
that was updated in 1980 after you had gone. But was it your experience that you did become involved in updates of that manual from 1974 to 1978?
Oh yes, I think it was always something in our mind, and people were doing things with it. Yep.
Do you agree with me that there's nothing in that manual between 1974 and 1978 that sets out a policy for reporting any instances of sexual abuse?
I think that's very likely, because sexual abuse was not something clearly defined, and neither was it on the top of our agenda.
Did you become aware at any stage while you were superintendent from 74 to 78 of instances of abuse between the children, so that's between the residents?
I can't recall any specifically. And we did monitor events daily, but I can't recall any specific instances at this
Would
stage.
you have expected that as superintendent, any incidents of sexual abuse, either between the residents firstly, would have been reported to you?
Yes, they would have been reported, yep.
And you can't remember any such report?
I can't specifically remember any such reports, no.
And what about abuse of children by staff members? Were you ever alerted to that?
I was never made aware of sexual abuse
yes.
of a child by a staff member, no.
As a superintendent of an institution like Winlaton, you would be aware that many of the children were coming from home backgrounds where they had experienced severe physical abuse.
Yes.
Were you aware of the fact that many of those children had experienced sexual abuse in the home?
Yes.
And did that give you any heightened awareness of the fact that the children themselves might then act out aggression or be severely disturbed by their sexual abuse?
We were aware of that, and I do recall instances where young people disclosed abuse at home after they had found somebody they felt they could trust enough to disclose.
I'll come back to that. In relation to the children being victims of abuse in Winlaton, were you suspicious at any time, or did you have any heightened alert about the residents themselves becoming the victims of sexual abuse, either from other residents or from staff? Or did it just not cross your mind?
I think that that I would have been aware that the potential was there. It was not uncommon for young people to display crushes on each other. There were, friendships that were changing from time to time. So, one was aware of those sort of relationship issues. But I can't recall any particular instances.
When you say that you were aware that residents would develop crushes on each other from time to time, did you imagine that to be harmless infatuations?
Oh, you could call it that, yeah. Yep.
So it's fair to say from your evidence that it was not in your mind at the time that any of the residents were at risk of being sexually abused by each other or by another resident?
Well, I can't deny the possibility that they would have been abused. I just can't recall any specific instance that comes to mind.
The absence of any policy between 74 and 78 to deal with that, with an allegation of abuse, suggests that it wasn't at the forefront of your mind.
No, sexual abuse was not at the forefront of my mind, no.
In your statement at paragraph 24, you say child sexual abuse and many other aspects of sexuality were a concern, but often were not easily addressed or discussed. Child sexual abuse was not named as such, nor singled out for particular attention. Whether this was a product of the broader culture at the time or specific to the institution itself is hard for me to recall. Does that suggest that you don't recall any discussions between yourself and staff about how to deal with allegations of sexual abuse?
I think we would have had discussions about the various aspects of sexual behaviour and sexuality.
When would those discussions have taken place?
Well, in the course of meetings, or in individual conversations between staff. The issue of promiscuity, prostitution, was probably more on people's agenda than the notion of child sexual abuse. Now, it may be that one would reframe the way in which those things are described, but certainly there were concerns, particularly about the physical health of girls, the fact that many of them were admitted with STDs and infections, and that many of them were actually prostituting before they were admitted.
So the major concern in terms of sexual incidents was the morality and health of the girls when they were let out on weekend leave. Is that right?
I think that would have been an important aspect, yeah.
And there was no real focus on the risk to the children of being sexually abused in the institution, either by another child or by the staff?
No, I wouldn't say that it was totally absent from our minds. I think, and it may be that if I was to trawl back through the report books over that 4-year period, that there would be instances which one might label as sexual abuse or girls engaging in lesbian contact with each other in the context of the fact that they shared rooms, they were at times on trust and in each other's presence. And there would be times when they were outside the institution when they would spend time together. But if we go back to the 1970s, I think the whole society was grappling with those issues, and the language of child sexual abuse did not appear until sometime a little further down that track.
And the fact that the language of child sexual abuse didn't appear, doesn't that suggest that in fact there wasn't really an awareness of the possibility that children could be subject to that abuse within the institution?
There probably was not sufficient awareness.
And there wasn't sufficient awareness of the possibility that children could be the subject of sexual abuse by staff members?
I would say that there was probably not sufficient awareness, yeah. Because
if there had been sufficient awareness, there would have been a policy that informed staff about how to deal with it, wouldn't there?
Yes, there would have been.
I know that in your statement you've told the Royal Commission that you cannot recall any instance of sexual abuse involving staff being reported to you, and you have no such knowledge. Have you read the statement which is available to the Royal Commission of Karen Hodkinson?
I have not read a statement.
Have you read the statement of any of the survivors who've given evidence before the Royal Commission?
Yeah, I've read one statement that.
I just want to read to you her statement in relation to her abuse at Winlaton in 1974 when she was transferred from Kooringal to Leewarra. And I'm reading from her statement from paragraph 31. She says, while she was in Kooringal, she was assigned a social worker, Paul Yu, by the Social Welfare Department. Do you recall Paul Yu?
I was not able to recall Paul Yu, and his name was mentioned in the briefing that I had about preparing a statement. The name Karen Hodgkinson was ringing a bell with me, but I couldn't add any detail to that at the time. So there's a vague recollection, but it's not more than that.
So it sounds that at some stage it must have been drawn to your attention that Ms Hodgkinson reports being sexually abused by Mr Yu?
It was not drawn to my attention.
I see. Okay. Well, Mr Hodgkinson has described to the Royal Commission of an occasion when Mr Yu put his hand on her leg and told her that he could make things easy for her if she was nice to him, and he went on to sexually abuse her. When Mr Yu left for that day, Mrs Baxter unlocked the main door and let Mr Yu out. And if you'll see paragraph 42 in that statement come up on the screen, where she describes reporting the sexual abuse. After you had left, Mrs Baxter asked me, "What's wrong?" I remember breaking down and telling Mrs Baxter that you had just touched me. Mrs Baxter then slapped me across the face and said words to the effect of, "How dare you make up such dirty lies about one of my staff members? You are nothing but a dirty, lying little bitch. Girls like you are why we have places like this, because you need to be taught to tell the truth." I kept telling Mrs Baxter that I wasn't lying. However, she refused to believe me and took me back to Gunya. I was then locked up in Gunya for a couple of days in the section behind a wall made of glass bricks. This is where girls were sent if they misbehaved. How do you feel about that account of a child in your institution disclosing sexual abuse to a staff member and being treated like that?
I think that's dreadful. I can't in any way condone or justify that sort of behaviour. The only observation perhaps I would think is that that moral sort of sense of what things are all about was possibly part of Mrs Baxter's way of looking at the world, and also part of her frame of reference may be that staff were to be trusted more than a word of young people. But if I'd known about it, would have been shocked.
That reflects, doesn't it, a culture, I would draw that, that might reflect an attitude of Mrs Baxter that children were not to be believed if they made these claims.
Yeah, I would say that's possible.
And an attitude that children were manipulative or sneaky in some way.
I don't think that was her general demeanour, but I can imagine that there may have been instances where she would behave that way.
In paragraph 47 of your statement, you say, I sought to encourage warm, caring and respectful relationships between staff and young people. That example I've just read to you is anything other than a respectful relationship between staff and a young person, agreed?
Absolutely.
You could understand in that environment why some girls would never report being sexually abused by a staff member, knowing that's the reception they're going to receive.
Yes, I'd agree with that.
The Royal Commission heard evidence yesterday from Ms Minister in relation to the number of children at Winlaton who had suffered rape by a family member. You noted earlier that you were aware that many of the children at Winlaton had been abused in that way by family members. I just want to read to you the evidence of Ms Minister in relation to her reflections. She says, page 9437 yesterday, she's asked, over the period of time that you were in Winlaton, can you estimate for the Royal Commission how many children there were who you were dealing with who had been raped by a member of her family? Obviously, you can't give us an exact figure. Was it more than 10, more than 5, more than 20, more than 50? She says, I would have said there were hundreds. Honestly, in all the years I was there, I would say hundreds in estimation. She's then asked, hundreds of children have been raped by members of their family. She says often it was suspected that that was what was going on in the dynamics of a girl's family, but the girl wouldn't divulge it, but there were signs of it. When she's later asked how many of the girls that she became aware of had actually been raped once the issue was discussed with them, she says more than 100. Now, she was at Winlaton for some 15 years. But does that figure shock you, given your knowledge of the girls who were subject to rape within the family?
No, it doesn't shock me. We were dealing with about 1,000 admissions a year. That doesn't represent some of those multiple admissions, but there was a very fast-moving throughput at Winlaton. In Mr Minister's 15 years, she would have seen many, many girls, and that number wouldn't surprise me.
And in your 4 years, you became aware of many girls who had been raped by members of their family who were residents at Winlaton?
Some. I'm not sure that I would say it was many, but it would likely be more than I was aware of.
What programs were there or what assistance was there for girls who had been the victims of that serious sexual abuse during your 4 years at Winlaton?
Do you mean counselling programs or
what assistance with them generally, emotional, physical, legal, was there for those children who had been the victims of serious sexual abuse?
The expectation would be that the professional staff in the institution were available to provide counselling, emotional support. We had always access to a consulting psychiatrist who was frequently in the institution. Where cases were picked up by any of the staff or the social workers who were working with them, and of course that increasingly over that time included regional social workers who would be visiting families, coming and seeing girls in the institution. Then those issues would be referred to those professional staff for the social, emotional, psychological support. In terms of legal programs, I think that we are dealing with a different era, very much so, from the era that we're currently in.
So let me just ask you this question then. In that respect, would you have had an expectation that children who disclosed to staff members between 1974 and 1978 that they had been raped by a member of the family would be encouraged to report that to police, or that staff members would have reported that to police?
No, I don't think they would have. There may have been some instances where they would, but going back to that point in history, I doubt that would have been the first thing thought about.
Would it have been something thought about at all, necessarily?
I would think that in some cases it may have been, but I guess it was in advance of all of the things that have happened in the police about having child exploitation units, about the sexual offences revision occurred somewhere further down the track. And it's possibly fair to say, without engaging in analysis, that the police were reluctant to get involved in some of those family-related issues.
Were you aware of that as a superintendent between 1974 and 1978, that there was a reluctance from the police to get involved in those family issues?
I couldn't put forward a specific instance that comes to mind. It's more a general sense without working into it quite a lot more.
Why was it thought that it was not appropriate in some circumstances to refer matters to the police where there was a rape that occurred within the family?
It usually wasn't. It usually wasn't referred to as rape at that time.
It was referred to as incest, correct?
It was more likely to be referred to as incest, and I don't think anybody was sufficiently across the issue, and it was not seen as being the appropriate response to that, to involve the police. Yeah.
Do you know why it wasn't seen to be the appropriate response?
Well, I think the issues around those situations are extremely complex. And we have a long history between that time and now of people debating the consequences of people reporting rape and how successful they are in court, whether people are re-traumatised in the process of going through the issues related to it. And I guess the response tended to be to try to provide an alternative pathway and a safer place for the young person, rather than to engage in court processes around it.
You were at the time that BGD was there. Have you become aware of her case as a result of this Royal Commission? She was a child who was raped by her father for many years, including when she was on leave while she was at Winlaton.
One that's been reported heavily in the press. Yes, I'm now aware of that. Yep.
That was 1979 and you left in 1978. But you were dealing with other girls who had been victims of sexual abuse within their family. Was there any policy that you implemented while you were superintendent as to whether those family members could visit the children who had been victimised?
I think if we were aware that they had been victimised by that family member, then we would have acted to not allow that visit to occur. But I can't think of any specific instances, obviously.
And you accept there's no written policy to that effect?
No, there's not, no.
Just before I leave that issue, in relation to reporting to police, there was no written policy in relation to when matters should have been reported to the police. What was it? I withdraw that. You can't recall any instance where a child who had been the victim of sexual abuse within the family had their matter reported to police. Is that correct?
I can't recall one. That doesn't mean that it didn't happen.
But on the basis of the evidence you've given so far, we can take it that you would not have encouraged staff members to report to police.
I object to that, Your Honour. That's not the evidence, to be fair. My friend is asking a series of questions that are about a systemic nature concerning his expectations of the staff. What my friend has just put doesn't arise as an inference even of what the witness
I'm going to withdraw it and ask it as an open question. Would you have encouraged any of the staff members to report to the police any instances of abuse within the family?
I don't think it would, but I think it would depend on the particular circumstances.
In any case, no staff member came to you and asked you for your advice in that regard?
No.
And you don't recall giving any directions to any staff members in that regard?
No, not that I can recall.
Before you leave that topic, just to check with you, would it have been a matter of course or unusual for you to report incidents of known incest to the department, and if so, to whom and in what manner?
No, not as a specific report. It would have been a matter that was dealt with in the context of the treatment components, the psychiatric referrals, yeah, I think that's the way it would have been dealt with, rather than it being seen as a legal matter.
So there was no departmental instruction that you can recall that serious matters had to be reported to the department?
Well, serious matters would be, and certainly with hindsight, we would say that that was a serious matter. But at that time, I don't think we were sufficiently in tune with all of the elements of that to have it go down that path.
So based on your experience, and only your experience, would you say the department was aware or was ignorant of your knowledge of incest at the time?
I suspect it would be ignorant.
Dr. Owen, you recall the arrival of Dr. Slack with her husband, Charles Slack, in 1976?
I do.
Initially, there had been a proposal that she take over from your role, but you decided to stay on a little bit longer, is that right?
I wouldn't put it that way. I had never any intention of relinquishing the role. I corresponded with Dr. Slack when she was in America. She'd been recruited by a departmental recruiter. It wasn't in my mind that she was coming over as anything other than my deputy to assist in what was a fairly challenging role.
You note at paragraph 69 of your statement that she presented with a fairly strong personality. She was articulate and persuasive. You then say there was possibly a bit of a culture clash between her and those she encountered, myself included. However, it's my view that she did have the interests of the girls and staff at heart and was efficient and effective in the things she set out to do. What was the culture clash between you and Dr. Slack?
I think she came across as with a strong New Yorker accent. She was rather more verbal than perhaps most of us were used to, and she was very strong and forthright in the way in which she expressed things.
When she arrived, did she express her concerns with the way that Winlaton was being run at the time?
Yes, she did. Well, within a reasonably short period.
What were her major concerns?
I think she described the place as in mayhem and out of control, and made it fairly clear that she thought a large part of that was because of my incompetence or approach.
And that led to some difficulties between the two of you?
Well, I think it created some tension that we had to work pretty hard at managing.
Do you recall discussions about her suggesting that there was a boiling point in the whole institution?
I do.
And that it was at there were major crises happening?
Yes.
Which included breakage and vandalism and absconding?
Yes.
Do you recall discussing with her when she arrived around 1976 the levels of sexual assault or anything to do with sexual assault that was occurring in the institution?
I can't say that I do specifically, no.
I just ask that you be shown this document. It's a letter or a memorandum to you, Mr. Owen, from Dr. Slack, dated the 16th of December 1967. It's STAT.0630.001.0039, the document that I referred operators to earlier. You'll hopefully see that on the screen in front of you, Dr. Owen, do you?
Yes, I have, yes.
Okay.
Thank you.
It reads for those in the gallery, as I mentioned to you yesterday, in light of our conversation on the 14th of December, I'm currently in the process of preparing a report outlining the steps which I think are necessary for us to take in order to achieve the goals and objectives which we both agreed are desirable for Winlaton. 1, effective programs which rehabilitate delinquent females. 2, reduction of the necessity for group and individual lockup. 3, efforts to lower the boiling point of the whole institution, i.e. reduce the frequency of major crises, reduce damage due to fire, breakage, vandalism, eliminate sexual assault, lower absconding figures and improve the physical safety of staff and their morale. Do you recall now reviewing that, what Dr. Slack was referring to in terms of eliminating sexual assault in 1976?
Yeah. Now that I look at it and see that she actually used those words, I'm not certain as to what she was specifically referring to when she used the word sexual assault. If anything, I would imagine that it may relate to actions of girls with other girls, and rather than anything to do with staff.
That doesn't trigger your memory in relation to
it doesn't trigger my memory in relation to a particular issue, no.
You certainly agree that she's raising there the issue appears to be the issue of sexual assault as a problem.
Within that whole scenario, and I think my reaction to it was, well, that's putting it in a rather more extreme way than I was seeing it at the time.
It suggests that, I withdraw that, it's certainly the issues she was raising had not occurred to you to be as much of a crisis as she was trying to point out to you at the time, correct?
Correct.
Was there an element as superintendent in which you were detached from the youth officers who had direct contact with the children?
I don't think so. I think I had quite a significant degree of contact with the youth officers.
How did you attempt to facilitate contact between yourself and youth officers and the residents themselves?
Well, there were various meetings held through the institution that would bring us into contact with each other, but I used to visit each of the units reasonably often. If I was on call, then I would usually phone each unit before bedtime to see what was going on. I read reports from the staff daily, so I think I was reasonably in touch with the staff of about 80 people altogether.
Did you spend any time with the residents themselves?
Yes, when I first went to Winlaton, I was asked by the then deputy whether she had any ideas about dealing with the group of older, generally sentenced young people who she felt were not getting sufficient attention in the institution and its programs. And with that in mind, I paid particular attention to that group, and I started doing some group work with them. In the course of that, I developed quite good relationships with all of that group, which endured, I think, one way or the other for a lot of the time that I was there. But I also had contact with many of the other children as well.
Did you have any contact with the girls who were in Gunya?
Yes, quite a bit.
What contact was that?
Well, Gunya was the section which had the highest level of security, and it tended to house young people who either were a little older or who were a little more problematic in relation to their behaviour. When there were issues, it often involved some of those young people. So I was generally aware of all of the people who were there.
You were aware of all the people that you were there?
Oh, yes, and had contact with them. I would visit Gurnia from time to time, yeah.
And none of the children who were there at any stage reported being sexually abused to you directly?
Not directly to me, no.
And not to any staff member who then reported that up the chain to you?
Not that I can recall, no.
Do you recall the use of lock-up facilities as a way of punishing children?
I do, yes.
Were you concerned about the use of lock-up at any stage? What concerns did you have?
I don't think lock-up is a good solution for anything other than dealing with an immediate crisis. But it was not uncommon for it to be seen as a response, a punitive response. I was concerned about its use as a punishment rather than as a means of regaining control. And I was concerned about the length of time that people would be placed in a locked situation.
So where Dr Slack has raised in this letter that one of the issues you and her both agree are desirable for Winlaton are to reduce the necessity for group and individual lock-up.
Yes.
That reflects the fact that you were concerned about it as at 1976.
Yes.
Were you concerned about the damage it would have potentially on the mental health of the girls who were in lock-up?
Yes, I am concerned about that. I have been always concerned about that.
Was there anything done between 1976 and 1978 to reduce the use of lock-up?
I think we had substantially reduced the lock-up, the use of lock-up, even quite early in my stay at Winlaton. And it had probably reduced in the time between I got there and when Dr Slack arrived.
This letter suggests that you, at the risk of oversimplification, Dr Slack writes, I might state this disagreement as follows. That's a disagreement between you and her. Whereas you have told me repeatedly you lack confidence in several staff, Mrs Baxter, Mrs J Williams and Mrs R Hasselhoff, and hence in the girls as led by these staff to make fundamental decisions, etc. Well, I'll continue to read that, affecting their own lives. And whereas I think you believe that it is staff incompetence which has caused the situation in Gurnia, I am of the opposite opinion. Do you recall now your lack of confidence in Baxter, Williams and Hasselhoff?
I do, yes.
And what was that lack of confidence?
I think the matters referred to before that Mrs Baxter's tendency toward authoritarian responses and possibly the use of lock-up would be an example of that.
Was there any concern that you lacked confidence in their ability to ensure the safety of the girls?
I think their intentions would always be to ensure the safety of the girls, but there may have been some aspects of their style of handling situations which might not have achieved those ends.
And was your concern in relation to those staff particularly connected to Gurnia and the way that was being managed?
Not particularly to Gurnia. It was a concern everywhere.
I just want to read to you an account of sexual abuse in Gurnia from one of the girls who's given evidence, BHE. She says at paragraph 37, while I was in Gurnia, I was sexually abused by other girls on a number of occasions. There were about 20 girls in total in Gurnia. We all had to share a room with another girl. I recall sharing a room with a prostitute at some stage. On one occasion, I recall that I went into my room during the day to get something when two girls came into the room behind me and sexually abused me. I felt helpless against them, and I was too scared to dob them in afterwards because I knew there would be repercussions from the other girls. Girls who dobbed were called laggers and were beaten by the other girls. On one occasion, I had a blanket placed over my head and was beaten by 3 girls after I lagged. I was also sexually abused in Gunya by a girl who was a lot older than me. She was short, had dark hair that was parted in the middle. She goes on to note that that child was a nightmare. She fancied her for some reason and she wanted to be her girlfriend. BHE was the new kid on the block and she was scared of other girls, so she complied and was sexually abused every day for a couple of months. She thinks the abuse stopped when that child was released from Winlaton. You tell the Royal Commission you had no idea that that was going on at Gunya in 1976 during the period you were there?
No, I had no idea that that was going on. And if those circumstances were occurring, then I would be alarmed and very regretful that anything like that could happen.
If those circumstances were occurring, it suggests, doesn't it, that the supervision of that section was completely inadequate?
Yeah, my experience of the section was not that the supervision was completely inadequate. I'm surprised that those events could occur.
Well, the Royal Commission has heard evidence that the layout of Winlaton meant that there were lots of areas that were hidden from the view of staff members where physical abuse could occur and therefore sexual abuse. Minister gave that evidence. Do you accept that?
Yes, there would be places, yeah.
And you would accept that there was a culture in Gunya where the girls were discouraged from lagging or dobbing on each other by other girls?
I think that's an endemic issue in almost every institution that I've had anything to do with.
Would you become aware that the staff members themselves discouraged girls from lagging or dobbing on each other?
I wouldn't go so far as to say that. It's possible some staff may have taken that view.
And in those circumstances, you could well imagine that this child would not report the sexual abuse she was experiencing because if she was seen to be a dobber or a lagger, it might get worse.
I think that's possible.
Dr Slack, we know, introduced a program called Triad. I would draw that you became aware of her intentions in relation to Triad and you investigated the possibility of Triad and what it was meant to produce?
Yes, I certainly
Were you in favour of the program?
I looked at it carefully. I was in favour of developing group work approaches because there is some evidence that they can be helpful. I had tried a little of it myself, which wasn't sustained for very long because of all of the demands of the position. But I was quite pleased that she had something to present, and I looked fairly closely at the content of it. And I certainly gave her approval and support in the process.
Did you ever sit in on any of the Triad meetings yourself?
I did, yeah. Not extensively, but I do recollect being, I think, in one or two perhaps.
Did you have an expectation that the Triad would be used for a whole range of issues or difficulties that children might have, ranging from wanting to abscond, having itchy feet to get out of the place, right through to having been raped by a member of their family?
There was a list of problems which I think exceeded 50, which Dr Slack and her husband had developed in the course of developing their Triad approach. And I can't recall the specifics of any of those at this point without looking at it, but I would imagine that it was an endeavour to encompass everything that could possibly be an issue. And
did you have any, you've already told the Royal Commission that you weren't focused on the possibility of sexual abuse occurring within Winlaton, but did you focus on the possibility that children would be encouraged to discuss sexual abuse in general, sexual abuse that they'd experienced in the community, in that Triad group?
That's quite possible, yeah.
Did you have any concerns about that group therapy and triad in particular for those vulnerable children?
No, I didn't have concerns at that time.
Were any concerns raised with you at the time about triad?
There was some controversy, I guess, from well, not very much. You know, my recollection is that it was introduced with a fairly comprehensive round of staff training. Dr. Slack managed to enlist a lot of staff support behind it. And the general appearance was that the young people participated in it without too many concerns. I think, you know, I was aware that at times there were some people who didn't want to participate. But
are you aware of whether or not part of the aim of triad was to get the children themselves to take responsibility for their own behaviour?
Yes, although the notion of triad itself was applied as an individual approach to helping people deal with their problems.
Was it part of helping people to deal with their problems that the children were expected to somehow assume responsibility or acknowledge their own responsibility for their problems?
Yes.
Did you expect that they would be told to acknowledge responsibility or to think about their own responsibility for sexual abuse?
That was not something that occurred to me at the time, but with hindsight, I can see that the issue with sexual abuse is to where blame is attributed is a critical factor. But our understanding of that is much more recent than that period of time.
Do you accept, and I'll use your terms with hindsight, that children who had been the victim of sexual abuse, if they were asked in that therapy to think about their own responsibility for that abuse, that would be totally inappropriate?
I think it's certainly questionable, yeah.
And could in fact cause them to be traumatised?
Yes, I think it's possible.
And it would be counterproductive for their mental well-being?
Yes.
But that didn't occur to you at the time?
Not at that time, no.
Did you become aware of medical examinations that children had to, I withdraw that. Did you become aware of any examinations by medical staff or staff of Winlaton that children had to go through after returning or absconding?
No, not as a matter of routine. There may have been some specific instances where nursing or other staff might have been concerned about a young person's health that could have led to an examination.
The Royal Commission has heard evidence that when children came back from weekend leave or from absconding, they were forced to go through strip searches and, in some cases, internal examinations. What do you say about that?
I don't believe that was a matter of routine. There may have been some particular young people where there was a health concern, where some sort of search, or could have been other reasons too, but not resulting in a medical examination, but because of the issue of contraband, etc. But it was not a normal process as far as I'm aware.
Did you become aware at any stage while you were superintendent that strip searches were being conducted on some of the girls after weekend leave?
No.
No, is that your?
No.
Would you have been concerned if you had?
No, well, perhaps I should say again, I have possibly some recollection that searches may have been conducted with some people, but not as a question of routine.
Did you have any concern about searches being conducted on some people, strip searches?
Yeah, I was not aware of strip searches. Perhaps I should go a little further than that, because the picture of what a strip search means, I think, can be described in all sorts of ways, from one extreme to another. We did have kids change from the clothes that they were wearing when they were outside to the clothes that they wear in the institution, and that was a common practice in Winbirra Remand Centre, and it would normally have been supervised by female staff. It may have been the case in particular instances, but I'm not aware of strip searches with an emphasis of that kind being conducted.
Would you have approved of strip searches being conducted when you were superintendent?
Not unless there was a particular issue.
I'm not talking about a change of clothes. I'm talking about children made to strip and then internal examinations in some instances to see whether they were hiding contraband or being made to jump up and down to see if anything fell out of them. Would you have ever approved of searches?
No, I would not have.
And they were you never became aware of any searches of that nature?
Didn't become aware of that happening, no.
Do you recall concerns being raised with you about police examinations of some of the girls in relation to carnal knowledge charges?
Yeah, I do recall some concern about that, yes.
You recall Dr Slack raising an issue with you about those concerns? And I'll just put up on the screen DHS.312.001.0003. I'm attempting to show you, Dr Slack, a letter of the 21st of August 1978, which you may have already seen, where Dr Slack appears to raise some of these issues. It's a letter to Mrs Yolanda Klempfner, the Coordinator of Women's Affairs at the Premier's Department, in relation to two possible areas where questioning and examination of youth offenders who are being subject to vaginal examination or questioning of past sexual history.
Yes.
And the letter is signed by yourself as superintendent. And it suggests that you raised your concerns about areas of examination. I withdraw that. It suggests that you raised your concerns about vaginal examination of youthful offenders in certain circumstances. Did that trigger a memory?
It does now, yes.
How would those issues been brought to your attention?
I would imagine that Dr Slack would have raised them with me.
So you did think that in these circumstances, set out in the letter, it was inappropriate for children to be subjected to such intrusive examinations?
Yes, I did think, but I would think that there would be a need to be justification if it was done.
You were following up on a concern that had been raised with you by Dr Slack?
Yeah, I believe so, yes.
Did Dr Slack ever raise any concerns with you about medical examinations that were conducted within Winlaton?
Not that I can recall.
And do you recall ever being drawn to your attention that the girls were being subjected to intrusive medical examinations at Winlaton?
No, I can't recall that either.
One issue that you were concerned about was the use of Depo-Provera, is that right?
I was involved in the controversy around the use of Depo-Provera, yes.
You were aware of the adverse publicity concerning Depo-Provera?
I was, yes.
You were aware in 1977, for example, that it was a drug that was only approved for development and research in Australia?
Yes, I was.
And you were aware that children within Winlaton were being provided with Depo-Provera?
Yes, I was.
What was the rationale for those children being provided with Depo-Provera in your time as superintendent?
It was a matter which there was a considerable amount of paperwork, studies, etc., that had been accumulated around it. It was an approach which was advocated by the medical staff. And the key issue was the prevention of pregnancy, which was seen as a serious issue for young people who were very clearly sexually active.
Do you recall when Depo-Provera was introduced as a contraceptive at Winlaton?
I can't actually.
Was it being used when you arrived in 1974?
It may have been, or it may have been introduced while I was there. But contraception was an issue, and I can't recall whether it was in use before I got there.
Is it a fair summary of the history of it that the main advocates for Depo-Provera were the medical staff themselves?
The medical staff, but I was inclined to agree that the risk of pregnancy for very young people who were sexually active was a very, very serious risk, and that Depo-Provera was generally available to and being used by other women in our community, and that although it was still on the list of drugs for approval for that purpose, it was seen to be safe enough.
But you're aware of the controversy and reports from America of the potential health concerns of Depo-Provera?
I read all of the material and agreed with the medical staff that the health concerns were not sufficient to counter the health concerns that came with the risk of pregnancy and other things.
But why would Depo-Provera, a drug which was not released other than for development and research purposes until the early 1990s, why would Depo-Provera be favoured over the other contraceptive pill which was released for general consumption?
I guess our experience was that the other contraceptive approaches were not likely to be used successfully, and we did often have issues to deal with related to early pregnancies, unwanted pregnancies.
Given that you had approved of a drug being used for girls which was not yet released for general consumption, what efforts were made to ensure that consent forms were filled out?
Yeah, there was attention given to the question of consent, and I believe that was undertaken by the medical staff.
Do you know what the policy was, and I withdraw that, do you know what the law was between 1974 and 1978 as to the circumstances in which children in Winlaton could consent to the use of Depo-Provera, and if they couldn't, where someone else could consent on their behalf?
I can't say off the top of my head that I am aware of the detail of that legal.
Do you recall when you were superintendent having any concerns yourself about the issue of consent?
Yes, I did have concerns about the issue of consent, but also the issue of medical consent was not always an easy one to resolve, and it was also reasonably new on the agenda.
The issue of a child consenting?
The issue of consent, yeah.
In our inquiries in this Royal Commission, we have been able to find very few written consent forms filled out in relation to Depo-Provera. Can you actually recall a form being developed during your period of time as superintendent?
I can recall some activity around the development of consent forms, but I can't recall in detail.
Did you have a view while you were superintendent as to whether children of a particular age could sign their own consent forms, as to when you would get parents involved, as to whether you yourself as superintendent could consent on behalf of children?
Yeah, I can't recall any detail of that, but I do know that had been discussed as an issue, because the issue of consent applied to more than the issue of consent for contraception.
In what other circumstances were you grappling with the issue of when a child could consent?
For some surgical interventions.
And so do you tell the Royal Commission that it was an era where the concept of a child consenting to medical procedures or to a contraceptive was just coming becoming something that was being discussed?
I think that's the case.
Prior to 1974, it wasn't something that was discussed in your experience?
I don't believe so.
I'm sorry, I missed
I don't believe so, no.
Okay. And so was that a concept that you became aware of around 1976, 1977?
It would probably be, certainly within the time I was there, it emerged as more strongly as an issue.
Was it an issue that you sought any advice from the department?
I believe we did, but I can't recall specifically.
Do you recall the advice that came from the department in relation to the issue of consent about medical procedures generally or Depo-Provera?
I don't recall the detail of that, but I believe we did get some advice, probably from legal people in the department.
Dr. Owen, my final topic relates to some comments you made in your statement.
Mr. Owen, if you're about to change topics, perhaps we'll take a break.
It's the time. Thank you.
And return at 12, and I ask everyone please to keep their eyes on the time and be back promptly at 12, ready to recommence. Thank you.